scene in the Civil War. We have NBC's John Dancy at the State Department now, Jim Ekleshevsky at the White House. And John, let's begin with you.
Tom, it's increasingly clear the United States has adopted a hands-off policy toward the future of Iraq, even if it means Saddam Hussein retains control of the country.
Shiite rebels said today they've been driven out of every major city in southern Iraq. Along the lower Euphrates, government troops used tanks, helicopters, and heavy artillery to regain control of several towns over the weekend. In northern Iraq, government troops have apparently regained control of Mosul from Kurdish rebels, but large areas are still controlled by the Kurds, including the city of Kirkuk. As refugees fled the fighting, the United States made it clear it will not intervene.
I think it would be inappropriate to try to shape or suggest even what government should follow on.
Obviously, the United States government thinks the democracy model is the superior model, but we at the same time are not in the business, whether it's here or anywhere else, on telling people and dictating to people what type of government they should have.
Scholar Laurie Milroy argues the U.S. has some responsibility for what happens in Iraq.
What is the American position on the use of tanks, artillery, surface-to-surface missiles against the civilian population? I mean, those kinds of questions aren't avoided by saying nothing. And saying nothing while they occur is an implicit acceptance of them on some level.
Meanwhile, Iran stepped up its support for rebel groups after Saddam Hussein apparently forced a revered 91-year-old Shiite cleric, Ayatollah Al-Khoi, to appear on television with him and advocate putting down the revolution. Shiites considered the ploy a sacrilege.
By not aiding the pro-Iranian rebels, the United States apparently intends to let Saddam Hussein win and stay in power, on the theory that a weakened Saddam is better than a government controlled from Tehran. Tom?
Thank you, John Dancy at the State Department. And NBC Jim Ekleshevsky reports from the White House now that while the president is promising a hands-off policy, the U.S. military is doing what it can to keep the pressure on. Jim?
Tom, it's been a month now since the shooting has stopped between Iraq and the U.S., but it's becoming clearer every day that the U.S. military is in the Gulf for the long haul. In a show of strength clearly aimed at Baghdad, M1 tanks like these from the U.S. 7th Armored Division are driving northward into Iraqi territory now held by the U.S. It's the deepest deployment of such a heavily armored division into Iraq since the start of the war. The Pentagon calls it a routine troop rotation, but White House officials claim it's also intended to drive home a point, to let Iraq know that until there's a permanent ceasefire, the war is not officially over. That goes for U.S. troops as well. Since the temporary ceasefire a month ago, only 20% of U.S. forces have headed home. But most of those are Navy and Air Force from rear positions. 90% of U.S. ground troops remain in the desert. It will take months to bring them all out. Even then, the U.S. military is in the Gulf to stay. On his recent Mideast trip, Secretary of State Baker talked with Arab allies about pre-positioning U.S. weapons and hardware in the Gulf. There are also talks to permanently base part of the U.S. Central Military Command in the Gulf, probably Bahrain. This would apparently not involve any sizable ground force. It's all intended to help provide lasting security and stability in the Gulf. A key Democrat in Congress agrees a U.S. presence is essential.
And if you don't have them there, you simply don't have a credible military deterrent in the region.
But experts warn of potential long-range pitfalls.
As long as the United States is there, they're perceived as a colonial power. Anti-Americanism will increase.
But by winning the war, the U.S. gained increased credibility with the Arab allies. President Bush intends to parlay that into a broader, more permanent U.S. military presence in the Gulf. Tom?
Thank you, Jim Ekleshevsky at the White House tonight. And like a burglar caught in the act, Iraq is admitting what it ripped off from Kuwait as part of the UN resolutions. Iraq now has had to submit a detailed list, and it includes $457 million in gold, $600 million in currency, 11 boxes of Kuwaiti banknotes. Kuwait, for its part, says that airliners and ships are still among the missing. When Nightly News continues in a moment, Robert Hager with the confusing instructions that led to a major airline collision in Los Angeles.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw, reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. The political and military situation in the Persian Gulf has many fronts tonight involving President Bush on Saddam Hussein's future, the battle for Kurdish territory in the north, food riots in the south, and this surprising development, a rift between the White House and General Norman Schwarzkopf. NBC's Fred Francis at the Pentagon, Jim Miklaszewski at the White House tonight. Fred, first the president on Saddam Hussein.
Thomas, Saddam swore in a new cabinet and got his army ready for counterattacks on Kurdish rebels. President Bush predicted Saddam would be toppled from power.
But the president conceded he did not know how long that would take, just that Saddam's grip was weaker.
But with this much turmoil, it seems to me unlikely he can survive. People are fed up with him. They see him for the brutal dictator he is.
That may be wishful thinking. Saddam surrounded himself today with old cronies in a new cabinet, and there were no signs in Baghdad that he was hunkered down awaiting the end. Many analysts say that Kurdish leaders cannot match Saddam's tanks and helicopters, that only if the Iraqi army collapses and many Iraqi soldiers like these surrender can the Kurds hold the cities in the north. In retaking some southern Shiite cities like Karbala, Pentagon sources say Saddam may have used more than tanks and helicopters. U.S. communications intercepts of Iraqi radio traffic suggest that poison gas may have been used in Karbala. Army commanders were overheard saying, "It's time to use the special things," and ordering, "Use the special arms now." After that, U.S. aircraft reported several strange white plumes in Karbala, and refugees there reported that poison gas was used. These defeated Shiite rebels also say poison gas was used. The gas and other weapons of mass destruction are to be destroyed under United Nations supervision, according to a draft of a UN ceasefire resolution, which the State Department says Iraq must agree to.
It would be the position of the United States that these resolutions, if adopted, should be implemented regardless of whether Iraq accepts it or not.
Forcing Iraq to accept the will of the UN could mean more suffering. Today, these Iraqi peasants rioted to get at Saudi gifts of food in a part of Iraq still occupied by the Allies. UN officials say people are starving throughout Iraq.
But despite the hardships, administration officials say that if Iraq does not bow to UN dictates, the economic stranglehold on Iraq will continue. Tom?
Thank you, Fred. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski is at the White House now, where President Bush does have a clean bill of health after his annual physical today. But, Jim, the president's blood pressure may have been raised a little, I gather, by General Schwarzkopf.
That's right, Tom. General Schwarzkopf violated one of the cardinal rules of the military. Never second-guess the commander-in-chief, especially in public.
This afternoon, President Bush tried to brush aside the controversy.
It's Schwarzkopf in the doghouse, Mr. President!
No. The flap arose after Schwarzkopf said he wanted to annihilate the Iraqi military and suggested that the president may have called off the war too soon. The remarks came in an interview with David Frost to be aired tonight on PBS.
Frankly, my recommendation had been, continue to march. I mean, we had them in a rout, and we could have continued to, reap great destruction upon them. We could have completely closed the door and made it, in fact, a battle of annihilation.
It stunned the White House and drew a sharp rebuke from the Pentagon. In a written statement, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney said the president's decision was correct and courageous. Cheney added that when Bush first phoned Schwarzkopf about the decision, the general raised no objection. The president stayed above the fray.
I have full confidence in General Schwarzkopf, but all I know is that there was total agreement in terms of when this war should end.
But others weren't so charitable. Administration officials compared Schwarzkopf to General Patton, who had wanted to march all the way to Moscow in World War II. They also stressed that the destruction of Iraq's military was never the U.S. goal. Officials said it would have helped the Kurds and Shiites, but would have hurt any chance for stability in the Gulf.
The White House is finding it difficult to pick a public fight with such a popular national war hero. Spokesman Marlon Fitzwater said Schwarzkopf is still a good guy who said the wrong thing. But another official put it more bluntly, saying Schwarzkopf's been in the desert too long. Tom?
Thanks, Jim. Well, Nightly News continues in a moment. Tomorrow's showdown between Gorbachev and Yeltsin.
But the homecoming is just beginning. The Navy family is together again. There is now some calm after Desert Storm. Family, friends, and just plain folks came to welcome home the sailors, home after 7.5 months at sea. 8 ships in the battle group that left last August. Thousands waited at Pier 12 for the giant aircraft carrier John F. Kennedy. Flags and signs, one that read, "Welcome home, FBI, Farm Boys of Indiana." The gates were opened about an hour and a half before the ship docked, and those waiting were anxious. Can you put into words what this day means to you?
Excitement. I can't find the words. I'm ready to see my son.
At 2 o'clock, the waiting was almost over. The massive JFK in sight, a roar from the crowd. The Kennedy being guided to the pier by tugs. It's a bit like trying to parallel park a 1959 Cadillac. The fins 90 feet off the water. Small lines to heavy lines to tie up 80,000 tons of steel that has been home to 5,000 men for 226 days. The first men off the ship were proud papas whose children were born while they were at Desert Storm. Then the floodgates of emotion opened for seamen, chiefs, lieutenants, who were now just honey, dad, son, whatever.
It's so exciting to my wife and my kids. Very hard being at sea with all my family and everything.
The war meant long hours on duty. On the big ships, days pass and you don't see the sun or moon. You just work, read and reread letters, and think of home. Now there are hopefully long hours of catching up on life, far away from Desert Storm.
That's I.J. Hudson reporting from Norfolk.
Against rebel Kurds in Kirkuk, and in the south, Shiite rebels are on the run despite some help from neighboring Iran. NBC's Keith Miller is in Tehran, Iran.
The devastation in Basra, Iraq's second largest city, is extensive and provides some idea of the level of fighting between rebel Shiite forces and units of the Republican Guard still loyal to Saddam Hussein. These pictures were released by Iraqi television, apparently to back up claims that the government controls southern Iraq. In Tehran, the exiled leader of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq conceded rebel forces had been driven from most major cities in the south.
Civilian life has ground to a halt there. Tens of thousands of people have scattered out of the cities. But I do know that the people are still controlling the rural area.
These pictures from Iraqi TV were broadcast tonight and reportedly show the northern town of Kirkuk back in government control. Kirkuk had been occupied by Kurdish rebels and reportedly under bombardment from the air. In the town of Zakho, headquarters for Kurdish rebel leaders, there were calls for aid from the United States and its allies. Iraqi forces are attempting to cut supply lines here. Iranian President Hashemi Rafsanjani denied claims that Iran was involved in the revolt in Iraq. He told the visiting Italian foreign minister the trouble in Iraq cannot benefit any country.
Western diplomats say Iran has shown restraint in its support of the rebellion in Iraq. This country is still recovering from its 8-year war with Iraq, and although it may endorse the overthrow of Saddam, it apparently wants to avoid being drawn into the fight. Keith Miller, NBC News, Tehran.
American forces continue to come home from the Gulf, more than 140,000 so far, and this was a big homecoming day for the U.S. Navy. The USS Saratoga docked at Mayport, Florida. 22 of the carrier's crew lost their lives in the war. For those that returned, a welcome from thousands of family members. And the USS John F. Kennedy, back in Norfolk, Virginia, after almost 8 months in the Gulf. For these families and many thousands across the country, joyful homecoming is followed by often tricky readjustment. NBC's Kenley Jones.
Do something. Let me kiss you.
What are you doing?
I've got to go work.
When Staff Sergeant Matthew King came home from the Gulf a few days ago, he figured he would have his wife Joyce all to himself, just like he used to. Wrong. While he was gone, Joyce started working for the Enlisted Wives Club at Fort Stewart, making telephone calls, writing letters, attending meetings.
It takes up a lot of time, and it's something he's not used to. The wife that's never home.
Yeah, the wife that's never home.
Yeah.
Trying to find things when she's not home, yeah.
Like many service wives, Joyce became more independent while her husband was away.
I don't need to depend on Matt for everything anymore. And where he's used to me depending on him, I don't know how that's going to work.
Yeah.
Neither does Matt.
First time something breaks, you know, we'll see. I'm going to say, well, you're independent. Go ahead and have it fixed. I'm going to watch the football game. I'm going fishing, you know. I'm out of here. You can handle it.
Family counselors say a lot of marriages face some difficult days ahead as returning soldiers and their spouses attempt to readjust to one another.
Sometimes people who have been in a period where they've had absolutely no control come back and want to control their environment. They don't want anything to have changed.
Major Judy Nupin, a Reserve Army nurse who was called to active duty in the Gulf, knows that feeling well. Her husband, Barry, had to play Mr. Mom for their 3 children, including baby Ryan, who was only 5 months old when she left. He changed the most while she was gone.
It's kind of like looking through a window at somebody else's baby.
Readjusting to the role of wife and mother has not been easy.
When you come home, it feels like you don't belong because they've gotten along without you.
Both Judy Nupin and Matthew King have a touch of the readjustment blues. Even so, both say they would rather be suffering from that here than still be over there. Kenley Jones, NBC News, Hinesville, Georgia.
One day after General Schwarzkopf was corrected by administration officials for saying the president kept him from hot pursuit of the Iraqi troops, he received a call from the commander-in-chief himself. The president today reportedly told Schwarzkopf not to worry about the incident.
The last leg of the journey on the USS Wisconsin. Tonight, he tells us about the men who are fresh from Operation Desert Storm and anxious to get home.
After an eventful 8 months away, the USS Wisconsin gets close to its Norfolk home.
It's all happening so fast, and just glad to be back.
The battleship's big guns aided Allied efforts in the ground and air wars, destroying key Iraqi positions in occupied Kuwait.
When you look on the monitor at the recipients of the shells, devastating. I would not want to be on the other end of one of those 16-inch shells.
Rob Siner, who has family in Salem and Roanoke, wrote many of the war stories. An editor with the Wisconsin shipboard paper, he kept pictures of his wife and daughter close at hand.
I've missed me like first Christmas, first birthday, so something I'll never be able to make up, but that's the way it goes.
Rob will see them both very soon. Before the ship gets to shore, there's some ship shaping to do. Gussying up the Wisconsin's bell, readying the anchor chains, getting the troops in line. After endless miles of seeing nothing but swells, suddenly, there's their homeland. Well-wishers motor out to greet the ship, raising the anticipation of those on board as they approach the pier. In reply, the ship raises signal flags, which read, "We are back." A crowd of loved ones clusters at dockside with everyone anxious to get a glimpse or a grasp. Then they get their chances.
Not used to this. Feels good. It feels good.
Rob Siner of the Roanoke area connects with wife Cheryl and daughter Meredith. While there is a lot of happiness the Wisconsin is home again, there is also some sadness. This battleship may have finished its last major mission. There's a lot of speculation the Wisconsin could be decommissioned for a second time. Many who served with her in the Persian Gulf don't want to see that happen. Not unlike those they greet this day, for many crew, the grand old battleships become a part of the family. One chief told me he shed tears when he learned she might not sail again. Rob Smith, Channel 10 News, Norfolk.
She might not sail again because the Defense Department says the Wisconsin costs too much to run, and financial support for the ship may be cut from the federal budget after this fiscal year. Well, as the USS Kennedy sailed into Norfolk, 3 petty officers were preparing to make the last leg of their journey to Roanoke. Cassandra Finch was at the Roanoke Airport tonight for their return.
Say it was an official welcome for Don Hudson, Bob Reynolds, and Bill Latham, as each walked into the waiting arms of friends and loved ones. All 3 men thought they had seen everything in the Saudi sands, but nothing prepared them for this.
I mean, I expect to see her and a couple people here, but not this kind of crowd, really.
Each one hugged and kissed as they tried to make up for moments lost. Bill Latham serves on the Roanoke City Police Department. But before he goes back on the force, his wife plans to treat him like a king.
Fix a nice Easter meal and all kinds of things. Look at that. His favorite cookies, cakes, anything he wants.
There will be more scenes like this. Joyful reunions ending months run apart as soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and reservists make their way home. Sandra Finch, Channel 2 News, Roanoke.
While thousands of Virginians celebrate today's return of the battleships, a support group in Southwest Virginia is crying for help.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw, reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. Saddam Hussein, who put up almost no fight against the forces of Operation Desert Storm, is now using everything in his arsenal to kill off Kurdish rebels in the north and Shiites in the south of his own country. And still no sign that the United States will get involved. NBC's Keith Miller is reporting tonight from Iran, which also has a big stake in the outcome here.
The victory that seemed so certain to Kurdish rebels only a few days ago is apparently crumbling under a savage counterattack launched by forces still loyal to Saddam Hussein. Kurdish forces say overwhelming firepower has driven their forces from Kirkuk. Fighting continues, and Kurds say the casualties are approaching a massacre. Izzat Ibrahim of the Iraqi Revolutionary Command Council is leading the counterattack on Kirkuk. The Iraqi news agency quoted him as saying the town was now purged of saboteurs. Kurdish leaders appealed to President Bush and other allied leaders to intervene by limiting Saddam's use of air power against the uprising. A spokesman for the Kurds said in Tehran today, Saddam's use of air power has been devastating.
If they do allow Saddam to use his air force to the devastating effect that he's been using in the past few days against us, then this war could drag on for some time yet.
In southern Iraq, the situation for rebel forces is even more critical, and Americans are watching it. U.S. soldiers occupying southern Iraq can see the town of Suk al-Suk in the distance, once again under Iraqi army control. The Shiite Muslim revolt here has been crushed. Refugees escaping the nightmare tell of women and children being gunned down. The reprisals have grown so vicious that many Iraqi soldiers are refusing to fight and surrendering to American troops. Hundreds of soldiers a day, more than 25,000 since the uprising began. At Friday prayers in Tehran, Iran's Justice Minister Ayatollah Yazdi called Iraq's counterattack a massacre and charged the Iraqi regime was out to destroy whatever is left of the country. Kurdish rebel leaders say they are in desperate need of medical supplies and food. Iran is already supplying humanitarian aid to the rebels, but insisted today it won't become involved in what it calls Iraq's domestic turmoil. Keith Miller, NBC News, Tehran.
And the Bush administration has the same attitude. It won't get involved either, and that's raising some questions. NBC's John Dancy is at the State Department now. John?
Tom, despite the slaughter of rebels by Saddam Hussein's tanks and helicopters, the United States will not intervene.
White House spokesman Roman Papaduk said today the issue of internal unrest in Iraq is an issue that has to be settled between the government and the people of Iraq. Only 6 weeks ago, President Bush seemed to be inviting a revolution.
There's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside.
In northern Iraq, where Kurdish forces are fighting Saddam, two leaders today noted that appeal and pleaded with the U.S. to stop Saddam from using helicopters and airplanes against civilians. State Department spokeswoman Margaret Tutwiler on Tuesday insisted the U.S. would like to see an end to the fighting.
Of course we would, but that is quite different from physically going and interjecting ourselves in the internal affairs of another nation.
The decision by the U.S. government not to use its thousands of tanks and troops to overthrow Saddam is running into criticism from Bush's own right wing.
He is, as a practical matter, helping preserve Saddam Hussein's regime against Saddam's opponents. And I believe that is a fundamental and unequivocal mistake.
In the administration view, the American people want to see more scenes like this, not more fighting by American troops. Officials say a U.S. attempt to overthrow Saddam would destroy political backing for the war. Officials believe it would also destroy the UN coalition, which has kept pressure on Iraq, leaving the U.S. to go it alone. And it would drag the U.S. into deciding which political faction wins and which loses in Iraq.
The United States, of course, does intervene internally in the affairs of other countries and does it frequently. It's doing so right now in Angola and Afghanistan, but not in Iraq. There, the rebels are on their own. Tom?
Thank you, John Dancy at the State Department. And when Nightly News continues in a moment, Schwarzkopf's apology. And tonight on the Daily
News with Tom Brokaw. Reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. Saddam Hussein has won for now. He controls Iraq north and south, but at such a terrible price. The question is, how long can he last? And who pays for this victory? For a lasting peace, the UN has a strict bill of particulars. We're going to begin tonight with NBC's Tom Aspel, who's in southern Iraq, and his report was cleared by Iraqi censors.
Officials took foreign reporters 60 miles south of Baghdad to Kerbala today to prove that the city is now firmly under the control of the Iraqi army. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, were killed here during the uprising against the central government immediately after the Gulf War. The city is in a daze. Thousands are homeless. In normal times, Kerbala hosted Shiite Muslim pilgrims from all over the Middle East. Today, it's a ghost city. The governor of Kerbala, General Abdul Halik, says the uprising here was led by ex-criminals. He said they used weapons from Iran to destroy every building in the city. The heaviest fighting took place around the shrine of Imam Hussein, one of the most sacred mosques in the Shiite religion. The mosque changed hands several times during the fighting. Civilians trying to seek shelter inside its walls were caught in the crossfire. The Iraqis say 6 of their soldiers were executed in this room by the insurgents, tortured and then hanged. There were executions in the nearby town of Najaf, too. This man has just identified the body of his uncle, a Ba'athist Party official murdered by the insurgents when they took over the city. More than 50% of Iraq is Shiite, but the government here says the uprising in the south was led by a small number of religious fanatics, with encouragement from neighboring Iran. Iraqi troops are today standing guard over the mosque of the Imam Ali, whose followers founded the Shiite branch of Islam. Inside, more evidence of executions, grim signs of a failed rebellion. For some Iraqi soldiers, the recapture of Najaf was a chance to visit the tomb of Imam Ali and to pray. The uprising against the Baghdad government is now all but over. The Kurds have been crushed in the north, and the Iraqi army now holds every major town in the south. Saddam Hussein remains firmly in control of this country. Tom Aspel, NBC News, Baghdad.
And at the United Nations tonight, the Security Council is meeting to spell out what Saddam Hussein must do if he wants that ceasefire that ended Operation Desert Storm to endure. NBC's John Dancy at the State Department on what will be a historic set of conditions. John?
Tom, the UN resolution is simply the most sweeping in history. By this vote, the world community will impose burdens on a member country that have never been imposed before.
The permanent 5 members of the Security Council, the U.S., Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China, wrote the resolution behind closed doors. Today, U.S. Ambassador Thomas Pickering began meeting the 10 other members of the Security Council to explain the resolution to them in detail. The resolution says that to obtain a permanent ceasefire and have sanctions removed, Iraq must destroy all its ballistic missiles, components, and launchers, destroy its chemical and biological warfare facilities and stocks, and promise never to acquire them again. Iraq must also agree not to acquire or develop nuclear weapons and turn over all its nuclear weapons materials to the international community. Iraq must also pay for damage it caused to Kuwait and other nations. Finally, in an unprecedented step, the UN will guarantee the border between Iraq and Kuwait. That could mean defend it, something it has never done before, anywhere. The resolution does nothing to end the civil war in Iraq. But by complying, Iraq can formally end the war with Kuwait, end the Allied occupation, and begin selling its oil again on world markets. The State Department sees it as the logical conclusion to the war.
We see the steps that we put in the resolution as ways of ensuring complete and full Iraqi compliance with the terms that have been laid out previously by the United Nations.
But former UN Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick says the United Nations is breaking new ground.
The UN has never done such a thing, nor has the United States ever supported such an action by the UN, nor any other permanent member. That's very important, very new.
The UN fought the war, now it will impose the peace. The new world order has begun. Tom?
Thank you, John. Before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he had a lot of help, it turns out, ripping off Iraq's oil money. That's the word tonight from the U.S. Treasury Department, which says that 52 front companies were organized to hide billions for Saddam's families. 2 of those companies were little-known American firms. How times have changed. It wasn't so long ago that the United States was supporting Iraq in its long war with Iran. Now, as NBC's Keith Miller reports from Iran tonight, some of the old animosities are fading.
The demonstration in support of National Day followed the pattern established by the Ayatollah Khomeini 12 years ago. Death to America, they chanted. But the voices were not so strong nor so many. The mass crowds that used to gather have diminished. There's even a joke among the people that the man leading the chant should be named the Minister of Slogans. Iran is changing. And the radical clergy that founded the revolution are losing ground to the moderates who want to end Iran's isolation and restore the nation's historic role as a regional power. Western diplomats are being welcomed back to Tehran. The turmoil in Iraq has made Iran a power in the Gulf that can't be ignored. By remaining neutral in the Gulf War and showing restraint in its support of Shiite Muslim rebels in southern Iraq, the government has gained a new measure of credibility in the West.
There have been attempts to rebuild bridges with the West, with the East, and even indeed with the United States. Relations informally with the United States have improved considerably.
A power struggle between President Hashemi Rafsanjani and radical members of the clergy has yet to be resolved. And only when the government can enforce its will over all aspects of society will it be considered really stable.
Iran has emerged from the Gulf War the big winner, and it never fired a shot. The challenge facing the government now is how to open up to the West without disturbing the Islamic principles on which this republic is founded. Keith Miller, NBC News, Tehran.
Well, Nightly News continues in a moment. In this country, a new credit card guarantee.
With Tom Brokaw, reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. Why doesn't President Bush want to help those who are trying to overthrow Saddam Hussein in the civil war that has been raging throughout North and South Iraq? That question has a sharper edge tonight with reports of Iraqi forces massacring Kurdish rebels and thousands of refugees heading for Turkey. NBC's Tom Aspel on the battle for Duqut. His report cleared by censors.
By the time the army arrived to take back control of the town, there was no one left to fight. Duqut fell without a battle. The Iraqis had help from Kurdish fighters loyal to the Baghdad government. They had nothing but disdain for those who led the uprising, then melted away when the Iraqi army came back.
They entered the city, this town, and they captured all women and children and took it to the mountains.
The only destruction in Duqut seemed to be government buildings which had been looted and burned by the Kurds when they took over the town 2 weeks ago. It seemed much the same in Arbil, 50 miles to the southeast. The Kurds didn't put up much of a fight there either, but they looted municipal buildings and police stations before withdrawing. Iraqi troops, many from the Republican Guard, said their push to take back control of Kurdistan was easy compared with the fighting in the Shiite areas south of Baghdad where thousands died. Today, the civilians of Arbil were moving back into the city. Most were to find their homes untouched. It seems earlier reports of heavy shelling and house-to-house fighting during the Kurdish uprising had been exaggerated. An American jet fighter made a few passes over the city in the early afternoon, a reminder to the Iraqis that not all of this country is back under Saddam Hussein's control yet. He's been meeting with his new cabinet to push for quick action to rebuild Iraq, while emphasizing the need for democratic reform here. Baghdad radio said today there are still isolated pockets of resistance to be mopped up in the south, but the uprising is over. If the U.S. and its allies expected Saddam Hussein to be overthrown, it seems they may have underestimated his strength. Tom?
Tom, I know that you're closely supervised there in Iraq about what you can say, but what is the reading about why the uprising in the north so completely collapsed?
Well, the Kurdish rebels in the north had expected support from the U.S. in the west. In the end, it wasn't forthcoming, not even political support, really. And armed with only light weapons, they were really no match for the Iraqi army's firepower.
And Tom Aspel, Saddam Hussein remains in power, but for how long, in your judgment?
Well, for the moment, Tom, absolutely in power, and he really didn't even need his Air Force to put down these uprisings. How long he can stay here is really anybody's guess, but for the moment, Iraq is firmly under the control of this man, Tom.
Thank you very much. Tom Aspel tonight with a censored report from Baghdad. Is this what the alliance had in mind? Is there nothing to be done? That question is getting a workout in world capitals tonight and also in Florida, where President Bush is on a fishing vacation. We've asked NBC's John Dancy and Andrea Mitchell to explore this question. John, first, the case for getting involved.
Tom, there were signs of strain in the anti-Iraq coalition today when the French asked the UN to condemn Iraq for the way it is putting down the rebellion. The head of the French delegation used a closed-door session of Security Council members to press for condemnation. There is no provision in the UN Charter allowing the organization to intervene in internal matters like civil wars, and it's unlikely the Security Council will take action. The Soviet delegate, shake of the head, probably spoke for most members. But as the Civil War continued and horrifying pictures of dead rebels appeared on American TV screens, arguments mounted that the U.S. should intervene. U.S. intervention in civil wars is a fact. Tonight, American arms are flowing to anti-communist guerrillas in Afghanistan because the United States wants to have a say in how post-war Afghanistan is run. The same is true in Angola, where troops of anti-communist leader Jonas Savimbi fight with U.S. weapons. Dr. Robert Hunter was a Middle East expert in the National Security Council during the Carter administration. He says the U.S. should be doing the same thing in Iraq.
Once the United States shattered Iraqi politics, and once the President of the United States called on people to revolt, morally, we're responsible for a lot of what happens. We're not doing it, but how can we, as a people, stand back and watch men, women, and children being slaughtered?
Intervention would also weaken Saddam Hussein and perhaps hasten his overthrow, either by the rebels or by his own officers. But curiously, even as State Department spokeswoman Margaret Tutwiler was defending the U.S. policy of not intervening, a clandestine radio called the Voice of Free Iraq was still urging Iraqis to rebel. One broadcast said, "Stage a revolution now before it is too late. We are on your side." Intelligence sources tell NBC News the radio was set up by the CIA. But apparently that's all the rebels are getting from the CIA, radio messages, no guns. The official policy is still hands off. Tom?
Thank you, John Dancy at the State Department. Now to Andrea Mitchell and the administration's case for staying out of this fight. Andrea?
Tom, the argument against helping the rebels is that it could easily become a long-term, bloody commitment. In other words, another Vietnam.
Why isn't the United States using its military power to stop the Iraqi army from smashing the rebels? Henry Kissinger says standing on the sidelines is difficult and necessary.
It is very painful. I am sure nobody finds it more painful than the president. But what he has to calculate is if he gets American forces involved in that war, it may go on for many years. The objective will become more and more difficult to define. We will be then obliged to produce an alternative government.
Any government that replaced Saddam could be even more frightening to our allies, Iraq's neighbors. If the United States helped install the pro-Iranian Shiites in the south, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia would feel threatened. If the Kurds won power in the north, Turkey and Iran would feel threatened.
The only thing that we can do now would be to use massive military force to smash the Iraqi army, the result of which then would be chaos and all kinds of rebellions. We would be suffering casualties in a cause that has not been explained to the American public, and for an end with which I sympathize, but which I do not believe warrants the use of American military power.
What about helping the Kurds the way we helped the rebels in Afghanistan, secretly? Kissinger says that may be possible in the future, but not massive U.S. intervention now.
And we would run a big risk of getting into a Vietnam-type situation again.
Kissinger said he is repelled by the way Saddam is smashing the resistance, but that the United States cannot make their civil war our own. Tom?
Thank you, Andrea. When Nightly News continues in a moment, Soviet prices, they doubled overnight, only adding to the pain. And in this country, tonight's Daily Difference. What works? This woman is off welfare. We'll tell you about the company that helped make it happen.
Who come from the Channel 10 viewing area. We will feature a salute every Friday night on our 6 o'clock news. And we leave you now with the first of our news salutes. Thanks for joining us, and have a good weekend. Good night.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. A commuter plane crashed
Iraq from becoming a military power and threat again. But that does not mean Saddam is about to give up his political power. Today, he met with his Revolutionary Council after he named his son-in-law and cousin to be the new defense minister. He is the man who has led the crushing of the rebellion. Clearly, though, this was a bad day for Saddam Hussein. In effect, he has agreed to put on an international straitjacket so he cannot again attack his neighbors. But he is still a threat to many of his countrymen. And in this country today, President Bush and Secretary of State James Baker met in Houston. Tonight, Baker is going to the Middle East. His first stop is Turkey, where he will meet with officials about opening their borders to more of the refugees. Tomorrow, the United States begins dropping relief supplies to those fleeing Iraq. And what is happening on the ground, on the roads, and in the high mountains as refugees continue to flee Iraq? The Kurds, hundreds of thousands of them, perhaps 1 million, are trying to move north into Turkey or eastwards into neighboring Iran. In either direction, what they face and live is a nightmare. Tonight, we have reports from our correspondents on the scene on both borders. Mike Betcher in Turkey and Keith Miller in Iran. We begin now with Betcher.
At the end of the food pipeline, still only a trickle was making its way through. Iraqi refugees have been told that supplies from the Western world are being sent to them. But they are now wary of Western promises, so they fight for every bit of food that comes their way, in case the newest promise of help is not kept. At a refugee camp on the Turkish-Iraqi frontier, the latest shipment was not enough to feed everyone. Turkish soldiers had to intervene to stop the riot. Some would have to wait another day for their next meal. And still more are coming. But the hardship they face is an improvement over what they have left behind. Those who have made it through speak of suffering and death. One Turkish official estimated that at least 1,500 Kurds have died during the passage through the cold and snow-clogged mountain passes that form the border between Iraq and Turkey. Their sheer numbers have overwhelmed Turkish authorities, who are allowing them to camp on a narrow strip of no man's land that forms the frontier. They have no nation now. Existence is a day-to-day struggle. They know they will live if the promised food supplies reach them. But if they live, they wonder if life will be worth living without a home, without a country. Mike Betcher, NBC News, on the Turkish-Iraqi frontier.
Up to 1 million Kurdish refugees fleeing the Iraqi army. Iranian officials say they have never seen anything like it. And it has been like this for 7 days. A stream of people getting out of Iraq, taking nothing with them but what they can carry.
No food, no clothes, no anything.
Many are too weak to cry. Most have walked more than 100 miles to get this far. The children and elderly are most vulnerable. Many are without shoes. The refugees say hundreds have died and been buried along the way. How can the world stay silent, said one man. How can the United Nations not protect our human rights, asked another.
So far, there's been no outside relief. For more than a week, no food, no medicine. The situation, which is already critical, is bordering on catastrophe. The next week will determine the fate for perhaps tens of thousands of people, the elderly and the children most vulnerable.
This is the only paved road connecting northern Iraq with Iran. Iran has opened its borders and is offering refugees whatever they can, but the number of people is simply overwhelming. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion can be read on the faces of these people, a heartbreaking exodus that is fueled by despair. Keith Miller, NBC News, on the Iran-Iraq border.
And what we've just witnessed there is not all. There is more. There is a third movement of refugees underway. In southern Iraq, Iraqis, they are Shiite Muslims, are fleeing into areas controlled by American forces. But what happens to those Iraqis when the U.S. forces pull out, as they will? Robin Lloyd is in southern Iraq.
100 miles inside Iraq at the ceasefire line, Iraqi soldiers are still surrendering. And refugees are still streaming across the border. But here they're arriving in U.S.-held territory. The majority are Shiites. Each day their numbers grow, and so does the refugee problem. But here it's a twofold dilemma. Not only increasing numbers, but also the question of their continued safety. Will it last if the Americans leave? Thousands now fill American-supplied refugee camps along the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border. Conditions are bad here, but they're better than what they left behind.
I have seen the shooting and the killing, and that's why I ran away. I came here.
This man says he and his family witnessed the brutality of the Iraqi government's crackdown of the uprising. He wants protection.
We don't know what is our future is. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring to us. When the Americans go from here, I think we are under the mercy of anybody.
Many Iraqi refugees here believe that once American troops are gone, nothing will be able to stop Saddam Hussein's Revolutionary Guard from attacking their camps. They fear a United Nations peacekeeping force will not be strong enough to protect them.
American forces soldier, they took me to the American hospital forces.
One of the newest refugees, a 6-day-old baby. Her father, a resistance fighter, is worried that Saddam Hussein will seek revenge.
Saddam was a criminal. It's easy for him to kill us here.
In these refugee camps, fears of reprisal are growing, as are concerns about an increasingly uncertain and dangerous future. Robin Lloyd, NBC News, on the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border.
And we hope to get some answers about that uncertain future tomorrow morning on NBC's Meet the Press. Our guest will be Brent Scowcroft, the President's National Security Advisor. And as we cover our world this day, we'll go next to Los Angeles.
Officially goes into effect. And for the Kurds on the run from Iraq, more promises of help and more death.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight, sitting in for Tom is Catherine Currick.
Good evening. At 6 o'clock Eastern Time, Iraqi officials at the United Nations were given the formal declaration of ceasefire in the Gulf War. But achieving the peace is proving to be a greater challenge than winning that war. We begin tonight with NBC's John Cochran at the White House. John?
Katie, the desperate plight of the Kurds has darkened what should have been a brighter day here. the official end of the Gulf War.
As the hours ticked toward the permanent ceasefire, General Norman Schwarzkopf was in Kuwait, where he refused to indulge in the gloom some people feel about the war's loose ends. The rebels in Iraq may have lost their war, but Schwarzkopf won his.
I have a great feeling of great victory, and I think everybody else does. And how anybody dares even imply that some way, we did not achieve a great victory, whoever does that obviously doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. It's that simple.
But nothing was simple today. The war has left more than 1 million Kurds scrambling for survival. The world's attention and sympathy are focused on the Kurds, and Saddam Hussein, still in power, is trying to change that. Today, Saddam's soldiers took Western reporters to what they said was a mass grave of 400 Iraqi officials executed by the Kurds. Saddam's troops also distributed supplies to Kurds who stayed behind, none of which impressed George Bush, who said Saddam is still a brutal dictator. Bush agreed with European officials on a plan to rush more help to Kurds still in Iraq.
We are going forward to give relief to these people where they are, and we're going to continue to do that, and we do not expect any interference from the man in Baghdad, and he knows better than to interfere.
The White House again warned Saddam not to send planes or helicopters north of the 36th parallel. Some in Congress, like New York Senator D'Amato, want Bush to fight if Saddam attacks rebels anywhere in Iraq. That argument did not impress the president.
I am not going to involve any American troops in a civil war in Iraq. They are not going to be going in there to do what some of my severest critics early on now seem to want me to do. And I want these kids to come home.
So, on the day the Gulf War officially ends, the president is saying it really is over, unless Saddam does something really stupid. Katie?
Thanks, John. Now on to the border between Iraq and Turkey. Almost 500,000 Kurdish refugees are massed there, seeking safety from Saddam Hussein, and more are said to be on the way. Here's NBC's Mike Betcher.
Another tiny grave is prepared on a hillside which is filled with fresh graves. Another infant victim of exposure and hunger is laid to rest.
Everybody know how much people be die every day. About 13, 40 people be killed.
She was the youngest of 4 children. The Kurdish mother worries that she will have to return to this place and bury her other children unless she gets a tent, some blankets, medicines, and food. What her family desperately needs is being unloaded at an airport about 100 miles away, a long 100 miles. When a Swiss cargo aircraft delivered supplies to Diyarbakir, Turkey today, relief workers had to unload the plane themselves. There were no local ground crews at the airport. The Germans donated tons of blankets and baby milk, but there were not enough trucks to deliver all of it. The German Red Cross chartered a U.S. Navy helicopter to help deliver the supplies, but rain and low clouds kept it grounded. There is a 100-ton backlog of relief supplies at this small airport alone. Once supplies are sent towards the camps, they must negotiate hazardous mountain roads, which sometimes are blocked by landslides. One relief worker says what is needed here is on the scale of a Berlin airlift.
If it's a heroic effort on that scale, we can still save the Kurds as refugees. If not, I'm afraid this war is going to be remembered as a tragedy for the Kurds of unparalleled dimensions.
The local Turkish governor says his nation is doing what it can, but he insists that there is only one final solution. The Kurds must return to Iraq. That is now not an option for the Kurds. They believe Saddam's army would massacre them. But Iraq's army need not fire a bullet. The conditions in the camp are murderous enough. Already another tiny grave must be prepared. Mike Betcher, NBC News, Diyarbakir, Turkey.
In Kuwait, the internal struggle to return to life as normal continues, but the war's impact is still being felt. As NBC's Robin Lloyd reports, many Kuwaitis are striking back at those they consider to be Iraqi collaborators.
They were tortured. They were not told why.
This human rights activist is frightened to talk openly about the continuing persecution of Palestinians here by Kuwaiti soldiers and police.
This is their revenge. They think that Palestinians are the ones who brought Saddam to Kuwait.
Nearly 6 weeks after the liberation of Kuwait, Palestinians continue to be seized and arrested, in some cases tortured. In the first few days after liberation, hundreds were jailed, charged with collaborating with the Iraqi forces. Many have not been seen since. International human rights groups say as many as 2,000 Palestinians are still being held. Kuwaiti officials acknowledge only about 100. This couple doesn't know whether their son Ayad is alive or dead. He was taken by Kuwaiti authorities, and police are now denying any knowledge of him. The stories here in the Palestinian community of human rights abuses are now commonplace. Almost every family seems to know someone who's been taken to jail by Kuwaiti authorities or been beaten by them.
I have been beaten. I have been beaten.
Fears of persecution are growing here. Unknown gunmen fired on the PLO embassy this week. A prominent Palestinian doctor, Salim Mukhtar, was killed near an army roadblock. Despite these incidents, the government denies that Palestinians are being targeted.
The Amir and everybody is very much concerned of killing anybody, being Palestinian or non-Palestinian.
Still, many Kuwaitis are demanding retribution.
You put my faces in for fire.
This woman says she was tortured by Palestinians working with Iraqi forces. She says they pulled out her fingernails during interrogation. Still, while some Palestinians worked with Iraqis, many others helped the underground forces, providing food and shelter. For decades, the Palestinian community here has lived and worked peacefully alongside the Kuwaitis. But now the legacy of the war is a climate of fear and revenge. Robin Lloyd, NBC News, Kuwait City.
The PLO, of course, supported Iraq during the Gulf War, and because of that support, Saudi Arabia today dealt the PLO a crippling financial blow, cutting off millions of dollars in aid to Yasser Arafat's organization. In Damascus today, Secretary of State Baker met with Syria's President Assad, part of a U.S. effort to arrange an Arab-Israeli peace conference. Israel and Egypt have expressed interest. Syria wants Israel first to agree to return occupied territories. When Nightly News continues, more than 24 U.S. military bases. Here today, gone tomorrow. On the Daily Difference,
Kurdish refugees in Iran, another 500,000 in Turkey, with tens of thousands more still in Iraq trying to get out. The Iranians have told the United States, we'll let your planes deliver relief supplies to refugees in Iran. In northern Iraq, above the 36th parallel, safe haven for refugees now is being guaranteed by the United States. But as NBC's Mike Betcher reports, safe haven doesn't automatically mean out of danger.
The Kurds have little choice but to accept life in a safe haven inside Iraq. Turkey certainly does not want the refugees settling in its territory. Refugees who are camped on the Iraqi side of the border are stopped and chased away if they try to cross into Turkey. But conditions in the refugee camps are so squalid and deadly that many Kurds say that if their safety was guaranteed, they would return to their homes immediately.
If Saddam Hussein don't kill us, yes, everybody won't go home.
The sight of U.S. Air Force jets flying overhead has instilled some confidence in the refugees that northern Iraq could eventually be made safe for them if Saddam is removed from power.
We stay here unless Saddam Hussein left Iraq.
But most find it difficult to think that far ahead. All their energy is directed at surviving each new day, finding food, staying warm, keeping dry. More emergency aid is arriving, but the food, blankets, and tents dropped from transport aircraft are a fraction of what is needed, and in fact cause panic as refugees try to dodge the falling containers. In the Turkuja camp in northern Iraq, refugees claimed that 5 of their number have been killed during the airdrops. Only the strongest and fastest reach the supplies. There still is no organized distribution of aid. After Turkish soldiers fired in the air to stop the mayhem, one refugee lay dead from a bullet wound. While nations debate their fate, the weakest and youngest of the refugees must fight for their lives. Medicines and doctors are beginning to reach some of them. One very ill child drifts between life and death, virtually helpless to control the course he will take. It is a fate shared by all refugees. Mike Betcher, NBC News, Diyarbakir, Turkey.
On another front in the Middle East, there was progress toward peace. Tonight, Secretary of State Baker heads home from Geneva after a successful round of negotiations on Arab-Israeli peace talks. More on that from NBC's diplomatic correspondent, John Dancy.
What we're talking about. The last peace fell into place in Damascus when Syria agreed to the regional conference between Israel and its Arab neighbors, as long as it has significant United Nations participation. Until now, Syria had always demanded an international peace conference. Baker said it doesn't matter what the conference is called, so long as the parties get together.
You know what's important here? Substance. Substance is important, not form.
Syrian Foreign Minister Farouk al-Shara said his country agrees for the first time to have direct talks with Israel as a follow-up to the regional conference.
The objective is of the conference, of the peace conference, is not to dictate to the parties, but to be effective.
So, in his meetings throughout the Middle East this week, against all odds, Baker has managed to get all the warring parties to sit down together at some sort of peace conference, whatever it's called. To do it, Baker has followed the classic negotiator's technique of putting off troublesome details until later. Some of those details: who will negotiate for the Palestinians? Will Israel have to agree to freeze Jewish settlements in the occupied territories? How much power will the UN have to insist that Israel give back occupied land?
The name of the game now is to keep working on those issues.
Baker brought one more player into the game today, the Jordanian foreign minister. Relations with Jordan have been cool since King Hussein supported Iraq, and today's meeting was to begin healing the breach. So it's been a good week for Baker. He has pushed the process forward one more step. But as a senior State Department official told us, we're not interested in a process for its own sake. We want one that can lead someplace. John Dancy, NBC News in Geneva.
So does the Bush administration believe peace may be at hand? The answer from NBC's Jim Miklashevsky at the White House. Jim?
Jane, nobody here is waving any olive branches in celebration. Not yet, anyway. The reaction is typically cautious.
By late today, White House officials still weren't sure what Baker had accomplished. They agreed there was some movement, but wouldn't call it a breakthrough. The situation appeared so uncertain, however, President Bush wouldn't touch it.
What about Baker?
But it's clear progress was made. Just over a year ago, the U.S. and Israel were barely talking.
Everybody over there should know that the telephone number is 1-202-456-1414. When you're serious about peace, call us.
Just a month ago, right after the Gulf War, Baker pushed for peace talks on a similar Mideast trip, but came up empty. But the victory over Iraq gave the U.S. newfound power and influence in the region. The Bush administration is determined not to let it go to waste, and Baker went back to try again. One key lawmaker said the timing is exactly right.
All the parties are together. There has not been this much an opportunity in the last 20 years.
But the White House remains wary. The day after the Israelis talked peace with Baker, they reaffirmed their claim to the occupied territories and expanded Jewish settlements, a major obstacle to any peace agreement. Some experts advise, however, not to expect too much too soon.
It is not the case that there's the opportunity for a major breakthrough, but small but significant steps are definitely possible.
But the Bush administration must move quickly.
You can be very sure that something is going to happen in the region, if not to blow up the negotiation, then to make it almost impossible to go ahead with it. So I think time is of the essence.
Officials here say it's impossible now to say where the peace process is headed, but it's clear without a firm push from President Bush and the U.S., it's going nowhere. Jane?
When Nightly News continues, some good economic news for a change. And
good evening, everyone. I'm Jay Ariano. John Carlin has the night off. The bulk of Roanoke's Bravo Company has welcomed in grand style at Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina. Among those returning was Sergeant Gordon Middlecoff. His wife Phyllis and their daughter Heather said that they would hold on to him as long as they could. Virginia Tech junior Robert Morgan was welcomed by his parents, just one of the more 80 tearful reunions today that all say they will return into one very happy party tonight. The troops are expected back in Roanoke on Tuesday at 11 o'clock. It is hoped Roanoke will turn out to welcome them home. And in Gate City today, thousands of people lie in the streets to welcome home a local National Guard unit. The 10:30. John Carlin has the night off. They are the men who cleared the path for others in Operation Desert Storm. Bravo Company, Roanoke's reserve unit of engineers, arrived back in the States today. Channel 10's Amy Smith caught up with the soldiers as they arrived in North Carolina.
Camp Lejeune, Jacksonville, North Carolina. For many Marines, the day begins like any other. But for one group of reserves, it will be a day they'll never forget.
All right, we're there.
Wives and sweethearts, moms and dads prepare to welcome the soldiers of Roanoke's Bravo Company home. The men, still 40 miles away at Cherry Point, are trying to adjust to the fact that they are back on American soil and are being hailed as heroes.
I don't feel like a hero. I just did something that had to be done. I had a job just like my father did when he was activated with this unit in 1950, I believe it was. Had a job and I had a mission, and I was called to serve my country, and that's what I did.
Over there, you got kind of lonely, but it was good seeing that everybody was really thinking about us, and it really meant a lot.
But what meant even more were the hugs that he would get just an hour later from his parents.
What's it like to have him home? It's great. It's unbelievable. Yeah, we thought it wouldn't happen.
The Virginia Tech junior says it will be a pleasure to get back to college and resume his studies. And the welcome home doesn't end here. On their way home, these soldiers will see hundreds of yellow ribbons and flags saying thanks for a job well done and remembering those soldiers still in the Gulf. Amy Smith, Channel 10 News, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina.
Bravo Company comes home to Roanoke Tuesday morning at 11. A big homecoming party is planned. And in another welcome home today for a welcome home, and there is anticipation.
There is a new flag to unfurl. There is cleaning to be done and a shopping list for favorite foods. Such are the preparations for Roanoke County resident Marty Haig as she waits for Company B.
I can't wait for him to get home and get things back to normal and just have him at the dinner table at night and see his truck coming up the street and just like it used to be.
Haig's son Bob is one of 120 Roanoke area Marine engineers who were met with hugs last Friday.
That's her fiance, my son. She didn't know the people at work did this. Oh, that's wonderful.
For fiancée Debbie Reynolds, the past 5 months have been tough.
But it's just something that you've got to do. There's hard times. It helps bring you closer being apart. It hurts, but you just have to have faith. I knew he was coming home.
Balloons, bows, and banners will mark a mother-of-all homecomings in Roanoke. For many families, Desert Storm has left a financial burden, but it has forged new bonds.
I have met some fantastic people in this group that I did not know before, and I feel very fortunate to have gained their friendship now. And I think some of those friendships are going to last.
Organizers of this welcome home say the Marines of Company B are already joking about the fact that when they get here to Roanoke, they will have to march the last 2 ribbon-lined blocks before they get to their reserve center. The action will be symbolic, given the fact that they served as a unit and will return as a unit. It will also be the answer to a number of prayers. Dave Henson, Channel 10 News, Roanoke.
Bravo Company is expected to arrive at the Roanoke Reserve Center between 11 and 1 tomorrow. Well, still to come on Channel 10 News.
Reserves as the Bravo Company comes home. Good evening, everyone. I'm John Carlin. The long-awaited day finally came, and tonight Roanoke's Bravo Company is finally home. They pulled into the Star City just before 1 this afternoon. In Operation Desert Storm, the Marines cleared Iraqi mines and barriers. And Dave Hansen reports that now most just want to get back to civilian life.
After over 4 months of waiting and anticipation, the final moment was here. The Marines of Bravo Company had jokingly said that they didn't want to march the final leg back to the Reserve Center, but march they did, to the delight of hundreds of family and friends gathered. In formation and dressed in desert fatigues, all 119 Bravo members made it back. For Lance Corporal Robert Compton, words couldn't sum up the sight of seeing his new daughter for the first time.
It's great. It's great to be back.
Been waiting a long time to say hello, haven't you?
Sure have. Too long.
After months of foxholes and desert sand, Staff Sergeant Mike Vellarini found a gang of fellow Roanoke County officers on hand to greet him.
It feels great. It's a lot different than when we had them back the first time I came out from Vietnam. It's just totally different.
For two Virginia Tech fraternity brothers, there were some things that were missed.
Budweiser is the way to go. Thank you. Thank you.
There are other experiences they will never forget.
Iraqi POWs. That's what I remember the most.
Why?
They just stank real bad, and that's made quite an impact.
Only one Bravo member was injured during Desert Storm. It's a statistic State Policeman Walt Baker will always marvel at.
It's almost a miracle. That's about how you can explain it.
But I could have never made it without family and friends and the support of our church. And that's what saw us all through.
For these Marines and their families, the experience has matured them and strengthened their bonds. There will be many adjustments to make, but for now, it's just good to be home. Dave Hansen, Channel 10 News, Roanoke.
Bravo Company will spend the next 2 days deactivating and completing paperwork. Family members say they want to thank local businesses and the community for all the support. There was another celebration for a Persian Gulf hero today. This was a presidential welcome home.
As soon as I got pictures taken and I got him back, got him processed and everything, I had him ready to send out a box that day, and he called and said, do not send anything else that day, and I hadn't mailed it out yet.
Robert says he's going back to work at the railroad, but not for a couple of weeks yet. He is going to take some time to catch up at home first. Students at Dublin Elementary School got a big surprise today. The children had been writing letters to 6 area servicemen serving in Operation Desert Storm. And today, they got to see their pen pals in person. Ira Quillen tells us about the friendships made during wartime.
The kids at Dublin Elementary School had a big day today. They performed some historical skits and did some patriotic singing, too. Not only are the kids here learning about old history, they have learned a lot of new history by corresponding with some history makers themselves, service people in the Persian Gulf the kids became pen pals with. Not only did the letter writing help kids learn about war, it helped our service people out, too.
The pen pals really helped. I had one in this class here, and I had a group of third graders that sent me a bunch of little handmade postcards. And like the major said, I used them as wallpaper in my office, too, along with a couple banners I had from some cheerleaders. And it really helped improve morale knowing that the people were behind us over here in the States.
We became our wallpaper over in Saudi where we were. It just really gave us strength and courage to know that America was behind us and what we were doing.
This was the scene when the pen pals walked into the gym where the kids and many of their parents were gathered. This was the first time the pen pals met. Ira Quillen, Channel 10 News, Dublin.
Some of these service people are from the New River Valley. Other servicemen knew people locally and were introduced to the kids in that manner. In other news,